Yeah, well, just to check up on things. So, just to let you know, we have this Saturday class. Can you all hear me, by the way? I hope you can hear me, yeah? So on October the 3rd, Saturday, October the 3rd, there's a sort of a Saturday class, Saturday morning class, 9:30 till 1 UK time. So just, I think Jason has sent out some, whatever Zoom date for that to take place. And then there's Jason's prepared some sheets. When we studied this signed reasonings before, a year or so ago, or whatever it was now, Jason prepared a sheet of debates, a sheet of definitions and so on. So that might be useful to some people, I don't know. Fresh way of looking at things maybe. So that was been sent out by Jason. Everybody should have got that. And then there's another document today that's been sent out, which is just the update of the sheet with a few debates and extra points on. So that was sent out sometime this afternoon, I think, by Jason. Right, Jason? Or you can get it in the meeting now if you haven't seen it in your email. So don't worry about that. If you know what's going on. Yeah. I mean, Jason's document's not complete. I don't think it's the whole thing, and I'm not sure even if it's totally accurate, but it looks nice anyway. Nicely formatted.
Yeah, it's not the whole thing for sure.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't manage to get to through the whole thing now. And then yeah, we're still very happy if everybody gets a chance to debate with somebody or other. Maybe you are all doing that now because you're all sort of none of you look to be particularly new students here. So you've all done a bit of this before. But if you do have a a lack of a debate partner, or you want to change a debate partner or something, I don't know, get in touch with Jason maybe, or he can organize another time. Just maybe it's not suitable for everybody to get together at once. The people who aren't here in the land of face-to-face, those who, just a bit more isolated. So do make an effort to debate this stuff because, it's not just about learning science and reasoning, which is very, very useful. But the being able to debate it, then it really becomes, you really have confidence in tackling those great texts. And when you're reading the way they put things, it'll be so much easier. You can know how to start figuring things out when you've got a bit of sort of debate, sort of fluency in your bloodstream or whatever it is. Okay, but also just to remind you, those who may not know, but I think most of you will know, there's this book by Catherine Rogers called Tibetan Logic. So that's been published a while now, and it's she gives a lot of explanations, sort of a lot of not kind of tight little debates, but sort of a more, this is what this Lama said, this is what that Lama said, and this is how it all seems to be, and a bit more of a extended explanation. So she might find helpful because the Loesling text I'm using is so condensed. So that's always should be available from somewhere or other, your Dharma Center library, or whatever. Yeah, okay. So I think that's all the first points to make. Right, so I think we've got to the Tunpe. This is correct, the similar example. Similar example, dissimilar example. So this is like the last of these little points before we get on to the actual definition of what a correct sign is. We've done the correct definition of sign, but now the definition of correct sign, you feel that you're really getting into the, the sort of main part of the text or something. So that's coming up now, but the last of these preliminary little sort of tasty bits to start off with before you get to the main course is this similar example. So what can we say about that? Well, the similar example is to do with recognizing or ascertaining the pervasion, of course. So that's one of the main features of testing whether the sign is correct or not. Is the sign established on the subject, and is there a pervasion? Basically, that's in very sort of simple terms, that's what you need to know, and maybe that's all you need to know. So how do you recognize this pervasion? And that's tricky. So I think it is one of the most tricky points in the whole syllogism, and I don't know who sorted it out satisfactorily. It's certainly been discussed, down the centuries, I'm sure. So, like we're saying, in the old style of syllogism of Aristotle, all men are mortals. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's one of Aristotle's, famous syllogisms. All men are mortals. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Yeah. So that's their way of, that's their old-fashioned way of, well, I'll say old-fashioned. It's the ancient Greek way of, trotting out a syllogism. All whales are mammals. Local is a mammal, therefore local is a whale. Yeah, perfect logic. Just that's Aristotelian logic for you. No, but anyway, go back to the first one. So we might say in our, the style of putting forth the syllogism that we've learned so far, although there are more than one, there is another style of syllogism that sounds a lot more like the Aristotelian one. Maybe we'll mention it later. But our usual one, the subject Socrates, he is mortal because he's a man. Yeah, so you have to work out. So if he's a man, is he necessarily mortal? So and if you can work that out, then you can say eventually, oh well, Socrates is a man, therefore he's mortal. So Socrates is immortal because he's a man. So if he's a man, he's got to be mortal. So that's a pervasion, isn't it? Socrates, subject Socrates, he is mortal because he's a man. So the pervasion is if he's a man, he's necessarily mortal. So that's, if sound is impermanent because it's a product, so if it's a product, it's necessarily impermanent. Yeah, so I don't think mortal is a particularly, thing that you need to reason about. A man, do we need to reason that a man is immortal? We see people dying, we see creatures dying around us, so it's not so hard to figure out that even Socrates must be mortal, or you yourself is mortal. So it doesn't need a great strength of reasoning. Just needs maybe a bit of basic reasoning, but doesn't sort of require a great deal of getting at a hidden phenomena, does it? So reasoning is more like getting at a really hidden phenomena, more challenging one. So sound is impermanent because it's a product. So then you're talking about something quite subtle impermanence on the subtle level, which isn't so readily kind of observable, just like being mortal is. So the interesting thing is, like, if you're realizing the pervasion, you've got to realize if it is a product, it is necessarily impermanent. Whereas if you're realizing the predicate, it's just like sound is impermanent. So it almost seems like the pervasion is harder to realize than the predicate, than the probandum. So why should it be necessary to realize that if it is a product, it's necessarily impermanent, in order to realize that just sound itself is impermanent? Sound is one subject. You're dealing with something simple, like one subject, the sound of my own voice or something like that, and realizing that's impermanent. But if you realize that if it is a product, it's necessarily impermanent, there's a whole class of stuff there. You've got to realize that anything in that class is impermanent. It seems like a harder task somehow. So there's things to think about there, and that's exactly what critics have said. Why do you have to realize that every product is impermanent just in order to realize that sound is impermanent? Isn't it kind of just making difficulties for yourself or whatever? So that's the kind of thing that we need to investigate, and I don't think just reading Signs and Reasonings answers that question. But if you go from Signs and Reasonings to studying Dharmakirti's texts on logic that sort of go a bit more advanced than the basic Signs and Reasonings text, they do ask that question quite seriously. So that this is where the correct similar example comes in, and the dissimilar example. Although the similar examples like more kind of the more one you seem to work with more fully. So sound is impermanent because it's a product. So you want something to realize, some way of realizing that if it's a product, it's necessarily impermanent. And then you realize the pervasion on that subject, which is the similar example. And then when you've worked it out that there is a pervasion on that example, then somehow you can transfer to saying, yes, well, that's true of this correct similar example. Therefore, sound is also a product. Therefore, it too must be impermanent, for the same reason that the similar example is, because you've worked it out already on the similar example. So that's a kind of, you wouldn't say like it's a sort of it doesn't always figure in when people are giving reasons and people are giving debates and giving arguments. Don't always use a similar example, but sometimes we certainly do. And I don't know whether it's considered to be absolutely necessary or not, but maybe there's sort of the hardline people who really take this subject seriously. Maybe they say it is necessary. You've got to have some way of realizing the pervasion before you realize the probandum, right? So you have to realize the pervasion. So how are you going to do it? So that's where the similar example comes in. If you already know that that Peter is mortal, he's died, and Patrick is mortal, he's died, and Stephen, he's mortal, he's died. So you've got a lot of similar examples. You've got a lot of men who are already proved that they're mortal. So to think of myself, oh yes, well I must be mortal too. You've got a lot of similar examples to say if as a man is necessarily mortal. So you've got a lot of other examples of men being mortal that you can think about. You see. So I think that's the point of the similar example, that you've had the experience, or you've seen what's happening on the similar example. Therefore, it's not so hard to transfer to the subject of your particular syllogism you've got now, and establish a predicate on it. Maybe one more example of that before we go to the text, and one they often use in the monasteries, and it's a very practical one too. Sound. On the Smoky Pass, there is fire because of smoke. So that's I think we've readily grasped that one, or some similar one like that. So we all know the situation. We're walking up the mountain. We can't see right on top of the mountain because it's kind of hidden by the curve of the hill. So we can't see any fire on top of the hill, but we see the smoke rising. And so from the smoke, we know that there's a fire on top of the hill, and we can go and get warm there or whatever. We've talked about that already, probably. So so you can say, you say to yourself or your companions, look, there must be fire up there. There's smoke coming out the top of the hill, and everybody will agree with you. So the idea that if there is smoke, there's necessarily fire. If there is smoke, there's necessarily fire, is pretty well sort of ascertained in our consciousness. So the pervasion of that particular syllogism is just even children of of a young age can figure that one out. And it doesn't take much to to point it out to them if they don't already know it. It's easily sort of apprehended. And but how exactly does the person who's learning about the world, how exactly do they make the connection between fire and smoke? You can't just say to them, look, wherever there's fire, there's smoke, and expect them to realize that. They know what smoke is, know what fire is, but have they made the connection between fire and smoke? And if you just say, look, if this fire is necessarily smoke, right? Sorry, if there's smoke, there's necessarily fire. So fire is the sign of smoke. So smoke is a sign of fire. So if there's smoke, there's necessarily fire. That's what I'm talking about. On the smoke you pass, it follows there is smoke because there's fire. So the provision is if there is smoke, there's necessarily fire. If smoke exists, fire necessarily exists. But you can't just expect somebody to realize that or realize it yourself just out of the blue, just thinking of smoke in general and fire in general, can you? No, you need something to get the experience from. So then, that will be, the fire in the garden or something, the bonfire in the garden. In the days when we were allowed to burn rubbish in our gardens, maybe we're not allowed to do it anymore. Anyway, in Tibetan example, it's always the smoky kitchen. So that's where all the smoke was. And you can see they're burning sort of just wood or yak dung and stuff. So the kitchens were very smoky, especially before they invented the sort of iron box stove, which isn't that long ago. The traditional medieval Tibetan kitchen would be really smoky. You're burning yak dung, which is very smoky fuel anyway. And you get it going and it's burning, but still smoke is pouring out of it. And the houses have little windows because it's cold. They don't want a big open windows and a big hole in the roof, do they? Because they want to keep warm. So that was a real feature of the traditional kitchen in a Tibetan home, would be the amount of smoke in there. But even in the monastery, and I remember going to Drepung and places, and they were burning wood. Nowadays they're using mostly gas, but there's plenty of smoke around. So you can see that's where you can tell, look, the smoke is coming from the fire. So we just look at what's happening and you can see the smoke is just pouring off the fire. And when there's no more fire at night, then there's no more smoke, Everybody's gone to bed and the fires are all out. There's no smoke there, is there? So you just pick up the connection between smoke and fire. So, but you do see that it needs a place or a specific example for you to get the pervasion, doesn't it? So you need to go in the kitchen and look, or you need to go into the garden and see the fire burning, or you need to make a little fire yourself. You're playing in the garden and you're as kids and you're burning sticks or you're burning cardboard or something like that, and you're seeing the smoke and breathing it in, so you get the picture. So that's what we're talking about here. The similar example is, so it's some practical thing like that. So just bear that in mind. I mean, I used to wonder, why is there a similar example? What's the point, But with my little example of smoke and fire and how a child would learn that if there's smoke, there's necessarily fire, then, the similar example is crucial, isn't it, really? So that's, useful in a lot of cases. Definitely sound is impermanent by the sign product. The similar example, very important.
Yes, you agree?
Yes.
Is it also because the idea of a similar example is rooted in the belief that all logic should be able to come back to an observable fact? And so like a similar example keeps that kind of in tow, so to speak. Direct perception, basically.
Yes, well, that's always a remark that's worth making, yeah. That at some point you're getting at a hidden phenomenon. It's got to rely on observation of manifest phenomena. Yeah, so that's definitely true. And when, the fire on top of the hill is a hidden phenomenon, but the fire that's, burning in the kitchen or burning in your garden in front of your face, that's a manifest phenomenon. Yeah. So you get this connection between smoke and fire in a manifest situation where both fire and smoke are manifest. right in front of your eyes or whatever, right in your face. So then you can confidently use that in a situation where the heart fire is a hidden phenomenon, like you say, like one that can only be got at by reasoning because it isn't near enough to feel. It's not, it's not in a place where you can see it. Yeah, so definitely it's coming back to the manifest, and that's especially true in examples like where subtle impermanence. Yeah, how are you going to have an example? Subtle impermanence is always hidden phenomena, isn't it? I mean, for ordinary beings and for simple people. So that's another problem, you see. So you say, oh well, we'll learn about subtle impermanence on a manifest, close at hand, easy example, and then we'll go to the subject of the syllogism sound, which is realizing the subtle impermanence of sound is like that's hidden phenomenon. We need reasoning for that. But where are you going to go to have a manifest example of subtle impermanence, you see? By definition, subtle impermanence is a hidden phenomenon. So how are you going to have a pervasion, correct similar example situation where you can have a clear realization of subtle impermanence, in a manifest way? Same with emptiness, there's always emptiness is always going to be a hidden phenomenon. There's no way of seeing it in a manifest easy way. So, that's a problem I'll leave with you for the time being. Something to think about. But of course, if you've already realized the impermanence of pot, the subtle impermanence I'm talking about, or you've already realized the subtle impermanence of pillar, so you actually know what subtle impermanence is, you've ascertained it, and so it's no problem for you to say to yourself, oh yes, if it's product is necessarily impermanent, I've figured that out. I've done the meditation and I've realized that, even though it is a hidden phenomenon, I've realized it. So if you realize the subtle impermanence of pot, subtle impermanence of pillar, then it won't be a lot of trouble for you to realize the subtle impermanence of, say, sound, which is our usual example, you see. So you can say, oh yeah, sound, it follows it's impermanent because it's a product, just like pot, because you've already realized the subtle impermanence of pot, you see. So, and that's a product, and you've got, you've worked all that out. So you're ready to realize the sound is impermanent too. So if you've already realized subtle impermanence, then realizing the pervasion is you're sort of home and dry. Then you're ready to go to the subject of the syllogism. But that's you've already realized, say, pot is impermanent or pillar is impermanent. So you've got a similar example, already understood. So that's another way of it could happen. So that's the kind of thing they're using here in this one. It's not necessarily here the newly realizing impermanent when they use the correct similar example of pot here, I think it is. So you don't have to newly realize impermanence here. This is talking about just realizing impermanence of sound. And you may already realize impermanence, but just on other subjects. So it's just turning your, it's getting a new subject to be understood as impermanent without newly realizing impermanence, which is, more of a challenge, of course. Okay, so that's just a little introduction and sort of justification of the necessity and the usefulness of the similar example. So don't think it's kind of a bit superfluous. Okay, so I'm in about the middle of page 12 then. The second, which is coming from page 11. Page 11 was, there are two bits to the explanation of the basis of relation to the property of the subject. That was the flawless subject sought to be known. And the explanation of the basic relation to the pervasion. So we were talking about the pervasion, and last week we talked about the similar class, which is, helps you to take another, get different perspectives on the pervasion. So this is also to do with the pervasion, the second part of discussing basis for relation to the pervasion, the similar and dissimilar class. So then the second, that which is held as a similar example is the definition of similar example. That which is held as a similar example in the proof of sound as impermanent is a definition of similar example in the proof of sound as impermanent. The pattern that should be known is that if it is selfless, it is necessarily a similar example in general, and a similar example in the proof of sound as impermanent in particular, but it is not necessarily a correct similar example in the proof of that. Yeah, so similar example then, or similar example in proof of sound is impermanent. That's kind of pretty easy. Selfless anything can be that, whether it exists or doesn't exist or whatever. So you can have sound as impermanent because it's a product, and you can set, you know, even impermanent or sound as a similar example if you wanted to. It wouldn't make much sense, but you know, once it's held or set as a similar example, then you know, that's okay. So if it's selfless, it is a similar example, and a similar example in the proof of sound is impermanent. So that was like we talked about with signs and everything. You know, everything is a sign. Everything is set as a sign. So everything is set as a sign in the proof of sound is impermanent. That's okay. But to be a correct sign and a correct similar example, that's a different matter. So where do we go from there? So now we're going to try and define a correct similar example, yeah? Never mind about dissimilar example yet. So now, correct similar example, it is observed as a common base of one being held as a similar example, and the proof of sound is impermanent by the sign product, and possessing the definition of correct similar example and the proof of that. There's a definition of correct similar example and the proof of that. So that's about the most woolly definition. What does it say? Yeah, but what's the right word? I don't know. Waffly definition that I've ever come across in my life. The definition of it is that it must possess the definition of it. You know? So that's, I mean, really it's a bit too feeble to even bother with, isn't it? But for some reason that's put in. So these great beings who compose this text and everything, they must know what they're doing. But, what to say? It mustn't be too rude. So maybe for the first one, what's the definition is that as we usually understand definition, but in that second second sort of part of the definition, possessing the definition of correct similar example, maybe you should think like possessing the correct similar, the defining characteristic or the defining characteristics of correct similar example. So at least it makes a little bit more sense, but of course it leaves you to decide what the defining characteristics of correct similar example are. So they want to challenge you. You've got to work it out. What does it? What does it have to be a correct similar example? So I don't see why it's so easy to work out without being told. But I mean, it's not too complicated. But you know, the bits I've got sort of translated from the other textbook will help us to you know, grapple with that sort of definition in a minute then. So anyway, I've suggested one or two things already. And it gives an example here, of course, fortunately underneath. For example, at the time of stating the subject sound, it is impermanent because it's a product, for example, just like pot. Pot, for instance. And my one of the smoke and the fire, I think that's some sort of, it's more easy to make sense of that one because we may not have realized the impermanence of anything yet, subtle impermanence. So, you know, we're still wondering a bit, well, what do they really mean by subtle impermanence? You know, what's this momentary change thing? Can't we see the things are momentarily changing and how momentary is the moment and all this, you know? So we kind of worry about what do they mean by subtle impermanence? And it's a bit difficult to, you know, sort of get clear information on it. It's not sort of there in every Lamrim textbook. But when we think about the fire, you see, yeah, we've seen the fire in the smoky kitchen. So we've realized the pervasion on the fire in the smoky kitchen, and then we can transfer that knowledge. So just as if there is fire, there's necessarily smoke, it's true of the fire in the smoky kitchen. So also, isn't it going to be true of the fire on the Smoky Pass as well, high up on the mountain pass? Yeah. Anyway, so what are the, to go into the detail of why that's true, how you can get confidence from one example and just transfer it to another one. Why should, just because there's where there's smoke in the smoky kitchen, there is also fire. Why should that be true on the Smoky Pass? In another place where there's smoke, does there have to be fire there necessarily? One place where there's smoke, there is fire, sure. Does that mean that every place there is smoke, there's got to be fire? Or wherever it doesn't say place, it says if smoke exists, then fire exists. Yeah. So we're looking at another place, like on the top of the Smoky Pass. Then, so there's smoke there. So are we really confident there's fire there? Well, we are, aren't we? Even though we've never been to the top of that pass, we know what smoke looks like. But yeah, there's a lot to work out, a lot of doubts to express and overcome. But that's the point, you see. So this correct similar example is previously to the actual realization of the probandum. Yeah, on the Smoky Pass there is fire. So that's what you're really trying to realize, the hidden phenomena. So prior to that, you have to realize if there is smoke, there's necessarily fire on the kitchen fire. See. So it's a prior thing, so that you realize pervasion in a prior instance, in a prior example. Then you can go to the realizing it, the predicate on the subject. So that's at the heart of the meaning of the correct similar example. See, it's somewhere where you can realize the pervasion, before you go to the thinking about the subject of the main subject of the syllogism. Okay, so I think that's about it really. But we'll, as I say, we'll read through the notes that I've translated, so we'll come back to that point in a minute. So it is observed as a common base of being held as a dissimilar example, which does not possess the two, the sign and the predicate, in the proof of sound is impermanent by the sign product, and possessing the definition of correct dissimilar example, and the proof of that is a definition of correct dissimilar example in that case. Okay, so this is just the opposite really. For example, at the time of stating the subject sound, it is impermanent because it's a product. For example, just like uncomposed space for instance. So if you're really trying to work out something which is quite, quite sort of difficult and, needs a lot of thought, then you also work the opposite way around, So does that mean that if it is permanent, then it's necessarily not produced? Yeah, so that's, what do we call those, yeah? When we're talking about pervasion, we say, if it is a product, it's necessarily impermanent. What do we call that one? That pervasion. Do you know, Francois? Unmute your microphone.
It's a correct pervasion. I don't know.
Pardon?
A correct pervasion.
Another word for it, actually. Do you know it, Jake?
Forward pervasion.
Yeah, that's the forward pervasion. So it's going from the sign to the predicate. If it is a sign, it's essentially the product. If it's a sign, it's essentially the predicate. If it is product, it's necessarily permanent. If there is smoke, there's necessarily fire. But the other one I just mentioned, so if it's permanent, or if it's not impermanent, is it necessarily not a product? So what do we call that one?
Counter pervasion.
Counter pervasion, yeah. I think that's what I've called it in this book. Can't remember offhand. Sometimes they say reverse pervasion. I think I've called it the counter pervasion. Can't remember at the moment. Anyway, so two pervasions, you see. You always think about the forward one most often, but even in the case of the on the Smoky Pass, there is fire because of smoke. You see, if you think about if there is no fire, then there's no smoke. Is that true? It will help you to to realize, you know, get confident and ascertain the pervasion in general, you see. So if there is if there's no fire, then is there necessarily no smoke? So that would be the reverse pervasion or counter pervasion. Yeah, so that's sort of coming in here, you see. So sometimes when you really set a sign out in all its glory, you know, perfection, you have a correct similar example to get the forward pervasion. When you have a correct dissimilar example, to make sure, you know, that you're really kind of, you know, tying up all the loose ends. Okay, so if it's a product, it's necessarily impermanent. Yes, I'm getting that clear in my mind now. So then that should mean that if it is not impermanent, or if it's permanent, you know, in terms of phenomena, it's permanent, then it's necessarily not a product. So you can check that one, yeah. So yeah, maybe that's really the way you have to go. You have to eliminate product, permanent on product, yeah. So the product can't possibly be permanent. That's one way of thinking about it, you see. Oh, if it's a product, it must change all the time, it must be impermanent. Yes, you know, you can think like that and give yourself reasons why that's true and give yourself examples. But you can also say, well, then if it's permanent, then it cannot be a product, yeah? So there cannot be any product which is permanent. Is that true, yeah? Is there any, you know, can you eliminate permanent on product? So you'd also have to think like that. So at that time, you're thinking about the reverse pervasion, and you can bring up something like, you know, uncaused space. So that's permanent. So is there any way that it's produced? Are there any permanent phenomena that are produced, and so forth? You know, so you can really play about with those two, permanent and non-product, you see, and you know, get them clear in your mind using a dissimilar example or several dissimilar examples. You know, there's something that's hard to crack, like subtle impermanent. You know, maybe just don't want one similar example. You have to have several. Anyway, one is you know, just given as what we're going to use. Okay, so that's the end of the section on correct similar and dissimilar example in this book. So after that, we go into the correct sign. So we'll stop there.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Question, yeah. By all means.
I don't understand this correct dissimilar example at all, because I just, like on page 13, the example, the subject sound, it is impermanent because it is a product, for example, just like uncomposed space. Why? I mean, I'm just totally confused.
Yeah, that doesn't look good to me either.
It's not a correct. You can't have. Well, it's not. You can't have a correct dissimilar example, can you? It's just showing you a dissimilar example.
Use it in if rest of the thing is valid. How can you have a dissimilar example at the end? I just don't get it.
What does it say?
Well, it says, for example, like uncaused space. So uncaused space is your dissimilar example, right?
Mm.
It's not saying uncaused space is like is impermanent because it's a product. So uncaused space in the proof of sound is impermanent because it's a product is an example of correct dissimilar example in the proof of sound is impermanent by the sound product.
Okay, maybe I just don't understand when you would use this correct dissimilar example.
Okay, but so we're not saying that, we're not pretending that uncaused space is impermanent because it's a product. No, uncaused space is an example of dissimilar example in the proof of in something impermanent being a product. Well, when would you use it? Yeah, well, like I say, you know, if it's something like if you're a child sort of figuring out that or ascertaining that, you know, if there's smoke, there's necessarily fire, then probably you don't have to really think about the dissimilar example much. But you'd certainly have to be aware, oh, like the fire's gone out now, so there's no smoke left, you know. So you'd have to make a connection between, if there's no fire, then there's no smoke. You know, they say, oh, there's too much smoke in the room. There's smoke in the room. Well, let's put the fire out, you know. So people say, put the fire out, then there won't be any more smoke. You know, if you're troubled by the smoke, you know, just pour some water on the fire or something. So then the smoke goes out. So like, you know, you make the connection like no fire, then you'll get rid of the smoke, right? So that's kind of you got to make that connection too somehow. But yes, if the forward pervasion is fulfilled, if it is if there is smoke, there's necessarily fire, and that's true, then the other one, that if there's no fire, then there'll be no smoke, is also automatically true. You can't have one pervasion being there and the other one not being there. So each of them, one was true, then they're both true. So in that sense, you know, you don't necessarily like have so much need for the reverse or the counter pervasion and the dissimilar example. But as I say, in other sort of more tricky cases, you know, you have to think about the thing from all different angles, you see.
So is it just?
So then, yeah, if it's a product, it's necessarily impermanent. Well, maybe, but what about those products that don't appear to change, like pot? You know, you can have a pot that's 1,000 years old, but it doesn't look hardly different from a brand new pot that's just made, you know, yesterday. You know, because something like or a piece of glass, you know, might be 100 years old, 200 years old, but you know, a well-made piece of glass, it may not look that like it's 200 years old. It might look quite fresh. Now, a piece of gold that was, you know, mined and melted and made into pure gold, you know, 500 years ago, and looking next to a piece of gold now, I mean, they would both look pretty much the same once you just polish the surface a bit or something, polish stuff, you know, the dust. So how do they prove they're impermanent, you know? So there are things where you still have doubts. So, well, is it really impermanent because it's a product? So then, well, you have to say, well, if it was permanent, then could it have been produced? You know, like to think in that way it could be helpful, you see. And you think of things that are not produced, things that are permanent, you know, like Ungo space, and the examples we have of permanent phenomena, like the absence of a dollar bill on my table and so on. And, you know, aren't they in the nature of non-production?
So it's just a way to reinforce your reasoning to be able to come up. Basically, I guess if you couldn't come up with a dissimilar example, you might be in trouble. Your reasoning might be a bit flawed, if you get what I mean. If you've got a syllogism and you can't come up with a dissimilar example, then you might have got the pervasion wrong or something. It's just a way to double check or reinforce, unless you want to count pervasion.
I would put it like that: double checking, reinforcing, certainly. But as that, yeah, less often used, kind of used. But it's you know, kind of there in sort of, you know, in reserve if you need it, sort of thing. Yeah.
Isn't it sometimes like because you can't find an actual example, it's easier to find a dissimilar example?
Your voice wasn't very clear there, Jake.
I was wondering if sometimes it's used because it's easier to come up with a dissimilar example than a similar example.
Have you got anything in mind?
Yeah, it's like there's this thing we did in Dharmakirti, in like Pramanavartaka, in the second chapter. Dharmakirti gives the example of boiling water, and that the mind is not like boiling water, because the more effort you put into like producing a quality, the mind doesn't become exhausted, and therefore it has a stable basis, unlike water, that the more effort you put into boiling that, it you know, eventually boils up and evaporates. Do you hear any of that?
Yeah, I got that. So where's the similar example?
It's a dissimilar example.
The boiling water is the dissimilar example.
Yeah, because it makes more. It's harder to come up with an example where the more effort you put into it, it never becomes exhausted. I think maybe. And so the water example is like a dissimilar example, but it helps you understand the point.
Yeah, but the dissimilar
The mind has a stable basis.
Yeah, dissimilar example has to possess the predicate and the sign. It has to be the predicate and the sign. So you'd have to set a sign up, and so the similar example possesses the predicate and the sign, and the dissimilar example doesn't have. It is neither of them. So, you know, to be nice to be able to set it out in a syllogistic way, but we get the general point there.
It's something. Do you want me to do that? I think I remember it.
Can I quickly ask?
Yes, yes.
So how would you answer if I said, consider the subject sound? It is impermanent because it is a product, just like uncomposed space. What would your answer be?
Say that again. Subject sound, it is impermanent as a product, just like uncomposed space.
Yeah. How would you answer that?
Well, I would say there's something wrong with your example.
Yeah.
Incorrect.
I mean, I can't.
Similar example.
Yeah. So if enclosed space is neither product nor impermanent, you know, it's not a very useful example to try and figure out why it sounds impermanent.
Yeah, but I mean, that's why I wonder what's the use of this dissimilar example. I just don't see any point in it, basically. If you use it in a sentence like that, it doesn't make any sense to me. But I will shut up now.
Well, just think of the you know, if you're trying to realize if there's you know, no fire, then there's going to be no smoke. Yeah. So you can, if you point to some piece of wet ground and say, look, there's no fire there, so there's no smoke arising from that because there's no fire there, you know. And you pointed a few examples like that. Look at the middle of this you know, puddle of water here. There's no smoke there, is there? And so why not? Well, there's no fire. So, you know, you're enforcing the kids' understanding that, you know, if you want to have smoke, there's got to be fire. So anywhere where there's no fire, don't expect there to be any smoke. So that's like, you know, the correct dissimilar example then is the puddle of water, or the you know, the wet piece of earth with no fuel there, so forth. You got your example, Jake?
Well, like as a syllogism, it might be something like compassion, wisdom can be developed infinitely. Yes, the subject, compassion, wisdom can be developed infinitely, predicate, because once there has been accustomation, a previous effort will make subsequent homogens more excellent without being dependent upon repeated effort. Yeah, and then he gives the example, unlike jumping and unlike boiling water. Yeah, so compassion, wisdom, and so on, they can be developed infinitely, because once they become familiar, the more effort you apply them, the more X will come. Unlike jumping, every time you jump, you have to jump, you know, it's not that your previous effort will make the next time you jump, you know, even better and better and better. There's always a limit. You're always limited by the physical nature of jumping. And then boiling water is the same. It's like the more you boil it, the more effort you put into boiling it, it's not going to improve subsequent instances of the boiling water. It's just going to exhaust it.
Yeah, okay. So
there are dissimilar examples that prove that predicate, you know.
Well, yeah, they help you to understand it. I mean, just because by, you know, there's a limit how high you can jump, even if you practice, you know, you reach the kind of a limit of what the physical human body can do. It doesn't prove that, you know, the mind is much further, much more sort of more limitlessly kind of improvable, as it were. But we see what you mean, yeah.
No, I mean, this is Dharmakirti's like proof. He uses that as an example. It's not like jumping, because it's it has a how does he put it? The boiling water is to show that the mind has a stable basis, unlike boiling water. And jumping ability is supposed to be the example to prove that mind has, the more effort you put into it, the greater the result will be, without needing to constantly apply more and more effort. Once something becomes completely familiar, it becomes effortless, whereas jumping will always require effort. Yeah, so like mental qualities are dissimilar from physical qualities, because once they become really accustomed, they become effortless. Where there's no physical activity like that,
I think that's
unlike jumping.
So not more like an analogy rather than
No, he posits
Proof.
them as example, as dissimilar examples. Just try and find the whole syllogism.
Well, maybe you can put it in chat for us.
Yeah, I will. No, it's not probably. He probably didn't put it in the syllogism, but it's in the commentary. I will. Yeah.
You have to extract the syllogism from his work. Yeah, well, if you could share that with us, that'd be great in writing, and we could have something to think about.
Yeah, I just got all these kind of slides I've put together, but yeah, I'll try and find it.
Yeah, or send it to Jason. He could share it with us.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll just read a bit of this sort of extra material I've got now, which keeps it a bit more down to earth than Dom Kitty's exalted stuff. So there's
This is basically Dharma.
pardon? Maybe you've frozen a bit now.
Go ahead. No, nothing.
So so we're on this one. So there was one that we didn't look at last week. I think it's from, or maybe two. So yeah, these are the ones on correct similar example. So I'm just going to read through the debate here. It says mid-page 22. So can you find that one? I haven't got my page numbers marked here. Sorry, I've sent you a document without page numbers, so it's not the first page. Third page. Third page out of 4. So I'll put page numbers in next time. Okay, you got it. Mid-page 22. With respect to our own system's assertion that if it is selfless, it is necessarily a similar example. Blah, blah, blah. Have you found that?
Last week.
Well, I just sent this document to you today. It's been extended. It was there last week, but now it's the debates have been extended a bit. So you really want this week's version, which is dated today's date, I think, 15th of September. So you got that, everybody? So let's just read these now. There's similar examples ones. There's a bit of debate and there's a bit of explanation. So it's not all debate. There's some explanation coming, but I'll just read it as it comes. Otherwise, we don't know. We'll just sort of cover what we haven't covered so far. So mid-page 22. So it's just picking debates out of this book, but he does give explanation. So, just a bit random. Anyway, with respect to our own system's assertion that if it is selfless, it is necessarily a similar example in general, and a similar example in the proof of sound is impermanent in particular. So that's what we just read at the beginning of our little section. It follows that if it is selfless, it is necessarily a similar example in general because of your acceptance. Well, yeah, that's what we did accept. That's what we've pronounced. So then it follows that dissimilar example does not exist because of your acceptance. And so if everything is going to be a similar example, there can't be any dissimilar examples. Right, Anila?
Yes, Geshe-la.
Pardon?
Yeah, I agree. There is no dissimilar example.
Oh, confident. Yeah, so it's accepted. It follows that dissimilar example does not exist because, sorry. If accepted, it follows that dissimilar example does exist because uncomposed space is a dissimilar example. So this is the challenger to our own system is trying to knock a hole in our own system. It follows that dissimilar example does exist because uncomposed space is a dissimilar example. So we say not established. So the subject uncomposed space, it follows that it is a dissimilar example because it is a dissimilar example and the proof of sound is impermanent by the sign product. That's fair enough, surely. Yeah. If it's a pot in this room, it's necessarily a pot, right? So if it's a dissimilar example in the proof of sound is impermanent by the sign product, it's necessarily a dissimilar example. That's a perfect reasoning, surely. But apparently we say no pervasion. It looks like that's our system to say no pervasion. Or is it? It follows that there is a pervasion because if it is a similar example in the proof of sound is impermanent by the sign product, it is necessarily a similar example and it is the same. So what do you say to that? What do you say, Chris? Sorry, Jimper. If it is a similar example and the proof of sound is impermanent by the sign product, it's necessarily a similar example.
No, it's not necessarily.
No. So subject, let's say pot then, that's the example I gave in the book. So pot, it follows it is a similar example and the proof of the sound is impermanent by the sign product.
Accept.
So it follows pot is a similar example.
No. Why?
Pot, subject pot, it is a similar example because it's a similar example in the proof of sound is impermanent by the sign product.
No pervasion.
No pervasion. But isn't it say the pattern should be known that if it is selfless, it is necessarily a similar example in general. So the subject pot, it is selfless.
Accept.
So it follows it is a similar example in general.
No. Why?
It follows it is a similar example in general because that is the thought of the greatly kind Geshe Sutrim Namgyal,
Yeah.
who's presenting our own system
Yeah.
on this occasion. And I'm sure, so that if he says that the pattern should be known that if it is selfless, it is necessarily a similar example in general and a similar example in the proof of sounds impermanent in particular. So that is our own system. Okay?
Okay.
So then subject pot, it follows it is a similar example. Subject pot, it is a similar example because it's selfless.
Yeah, no pervasion.
There is a pervasion. If it is selfless, it's necessarily a similar example because that is the thought of the greatly kind Geshe Sutrim Namgyal.
I think you forgot to say in a specific proof. Yeah. It doesn't help. It doesn't work.
Well, look, are you going to accept our own system or not? The challenger, they can go all over the place. The challenger can say, sound is permanent. The challenger say there is Ishvara, or the omnipotent God who controls all things. And the challenger can say there's no such thing as impermanence. The challenger can say there's no such thing as selflessness. But as a defender, you are on your honor. Your role is to defend our own system. So, if it is a product, it is. So the subject part, it follows it is a similar example.
Then I would say yes.
Well, you should. I mean, if you want to be, completely, you reinterpret the whole kind of explanation. So pot, it is a similar example.
Accept.
Yeah. So that's where we were, wasn't it? There is a pervasion because if it is a similar example and the proof of sound is impermanent by the sign product, it is necessarily a similar example.
Accept.
Yeah. So that we have to accept that, say, pot is a similar example, because it is a similar example and the proof of sound is impermanent by the sign product. So then it follows that, uncomposed space, it follows, it is, let's say pot now, we're on pot. So it follows that pot, it follows it is a dissimilar example.
Why?
Subject pot, it follows it is a dissimilar example because it is a dissimilar example and the proof of sound is impermanent by the sign product. No, sorry. So we can't have that. And the proof of sound is permanent by the sign product. Well, that's maybe not a good idea. I'm going off the rails here. Yeah, let's stick with pot, shall we? Well, let's stick with uncomposed space. So uncomposed space is a similar example.
Accept.
Yeah, so uncomposed space, it follows is a dissimilar example.
Why?
Uncomposed space, it follows it is a dissimilar example because it is a dissimilar example and proof of sound is impermanent by the same product.
Not a vision. Come on. This is okay.
Well, if it is a similar example and the proof of sound is impermanent by the same product, it's necessarily a similar example.
Can you repeat this one, please?
If it is a similar example and the proof of sound is impermanent by the same product, it is necessarily a similar example.
Accept.
So if it is a dissimilar example in the proof of sound is impermanent by the same product, it's necessarily a dissimilar example.
This is not. I will not accept.
So it follows that there is a pervasion, you know, if it is a dissimilar example in the proof of sound is impermanent by the same product, it is necessarily a dissimilar example, because if it is a similar example in the proof of sound is impermanent by the same product, it is necessarily a similar example, and it is the same.
No.
Yeah, so in conclusion, no pervasion, it says. So that's, somebody's saying no pervasion. What do you say, Anila?
I say no pervasion.
Say that again, it wasn't clear.
No pervasion.
So Anila
If
is
it's
saying
a
no
similar
pervasion.
example in the proof of that, it is necessarily a similar example. But if it is a dissimilar example in a proof of that, it's not dissimilar example.
Well, it's very arbitrary of you. Very arbitrary, you know. Yeah, okay, well, let's read the rest of the debate because we haven't got much time. The subject uncomposed space, it follows that it is a dissimilar example in the proof of sounds impermanent. This is reason not established, yeah? So no pervasion is standing as the answer. So like Anila gave it, and you know, Chris is maybe, sorry, Jimper is holding to that one at the moment. So, but if you said not established, you know, it's not established that, or well, it's not established that. So then you say, okay, the subject uncomposed space, it follows it is a dissimilar example, and the proof of sound is impermanent by the same product because it is a correct dissimilar example, and the proof of sound is impermanent by the same product. Yeah, so that's what we're trying to get to. So why is that? So no pervasion, it follows that there is a pervasion because if it is a correct similar example and the proof of sound is impermanent, it is necessarily a similar example and the proof of sound is impermanent, and it is the same. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on because otherwise, you know, we don't get to the bits of explanation which will be useful to us. So, you know, that definition was a correct similar example was pretty woolly, as I said. You know, it says to be the definition, you know, the definition of correct similar example and the proof of that, it has to be held as a similar example and the proof of that, and then possess the definition of correct similar example and the proof of that. So really, really sort of very strange kind of woolly definition. But he's trying to explain a bit now, the author of this other, you know, sort of commentary text. So he says, a correct similar example and the proof of sound is impermanent by the same product has to have two features. The two features are, it must be held as a similar example, possessing the two, the sign and the predicate, in the proof of sound is impermanent by the same product. And also, prior to ascertaining by valid cognition on sound, the basis of debate, that if it is a product, it's necessarily impermanent, one has to be able to ascertain by valid cognition on it that if it is a product, it is necessarily impermanent. Yeah, so there's two features. The correct similar example has to possess the sign and the predicate. So that's still not clear, is it? So he's going to explain that underneath, yeah? How does a similar example possess the sign and the predicate, and the dissimilar example not possess a sign and the predicate? Okay, so that's coming up. So that's requirement number one. Number two is what I was saying earlier also, you know, that the correct similar example is where you realize the pervasion before you realize the pervasion on the actual main subject of the syllogism. So I'll read number two again. Number two, prior to ascertaining by valid cognition on sound, the subject of debate, that if it is a product, it is necessarily impermanent, one has to be able to ascertain by valid recognition on it, the similar example, that if it is a product, it's necessarily impermanent. So maybe it's something you've already realized is impermanent. This guy might have realized pot already is impermanent. He knows pot's impermanent. He figured it all out. So he's realized if it's a product, it's necessarily impermanent on pot. So then he can go to sound and say, oh yes, well, sound's also a product. It is also, must be necessarily impermanent then. That kind of thing. So you realize the pervasion on the similar example first, and then you can go to the subject of the main syllogism. So then he explains this a bit about possessing the two, the sign and the predicate. Again, very traditional way of putting it. You'll find this in most debating textbooks about possessing the sign and the predicate. It's not just the Loseling textbook that's giving it this, traditional language. A similar example, possessing the two, the sign and the predicate, in the proof of sound is impermanent by the sign product. Okay, what does that mean then? It has to be held as a similar example, and the proof of sound is impermanent by the sign product, and also be product, the sign in the proof of that, and impermanent, the predicate of the probandum in the proof of that. So the correct, a similar example must be the predicate and be the sign. In this case of sound being impermanent, right? So your correct similar example, say pot, it has to be impermanent and be product in order to be correct similar example. That's one requirement, It has to be both, and it has to be somewhere where that particular opponent who's thinking about it, it's easier for him. He's able to realize the pervasion on that similar example before he goes to the main subject. So he's familiar with the pervasion. He's realized the pervasion before he goes to try to realize sounds impermanent. But that's only with these is arrangements. If it's the subject sound, the subject on the smoky pass, it follows there is, or shall we say, fire exists because smoke exists, just like in the smoky kitchen. So you don't expect the smoky kitchen to be fire or to be smoke, it's a different one, yeah? So it's not like he's explaining it for sound impermanent product, yeah? But if it's one of those exist syllogisms, the way that the similar example possesses the sign of the predicate, be a bit different, won't it? It won't be like an is thing. It won't be like, oh, pot is impermanent and product. It'd be slightly different. Okay, so don't just try to apply it to all syllogisms without any modification. He's only talking about in the specific one of the sound impermanent product, the is type of syllogism. And following on from that, correct dissimilar example in the proof of sound is impermanent by the sign product also has to have two features. The two features are, one, it must be held as a dissimilar example, not possessing the two, the sign and the predicate, in the proof of sound is impermanent by the same product. And also, prior to ascertaining by valid cognition on sound, the basis of debate, that if it is a product, it is necessarily impermanent, one has to be able to ascertain by valid recognition on it that if it is permanent, it's necessarily a non-product. Yeah, so before you realize pervasion, the correct pervasion, on sound, that if it is a product, it's necessarily impermanent. This is they want to bring in the dissimilar example. One has to be able to ascertain by valid recognition on it that if it is permanent, it's necessarily a non-product. So there has to be some way of being sure that the opposite is true too. Like if it's permanent, it's necessarily not a product. And then the related similar explanation. A dissimilar example, not possessing the two, the sign of the product in the proof of sound is impermanent by the sign product. It has to be held as a dissimilar example in the proof of sound is impermanent by the sign product, and also not be the two, product, the sign and the proof of that, and impermanent. The predicate of probandum in the proof of that. So once it's excluded from being impermanent, it also has to be excluded from being a product. Otherwise, it won't be, correct pervasion, correct syllogism. Okay, so let me just finish off what's written there, and then it's not a debate. This is just it's looking ahead really to the correct opponent. When we start talking about these correct signs, but since I've written it, I'll just read it out now. Kind of. So we have to say, you know, there's in all these signs here, and I'll say this again clearer next time. But you know, a correct sign always has to be a correct sign for somebody. Yeah, there's always you know, there's always somebody who's can use that sign to realize you know, the thesis or the probandum. So you know that person's got to have these certain collected qualities. Yeah. So just to read that, for the correct opponent in the proof of sounds impermanent by the sign product, many requirements have to be complete. Requirements have to be complete are such as, having ascertained by valid cognition that sound is a product, he is engaged in wishing to know whether or not this is impermanent. Yeah. So there's a correct opponent to whom you set the sign. You know, therefore it follows that, you know, the subject sound, it is impermanent because it's a product. In the end, you know, if they're going to be the person who's really suitable to set that sign to, then yes, first of all, they realized by valid cognition that sound is a product, and they want to know whether it's impermanent or not. You know, so they're investigating your argument, and they have number two, they have ascertained the relation between product and impermanent. You know, if it is a product, it's necessarily impermanent, so that implies some kind of relation between product and impermanent. You know, some sort of dependent relationship, some sort of dependent arising. So that's very important in between the predicate and the sign. I won't say anything more about it now. And he has realized that if it is permanent, it's necessarily not a product. Yeah, so that's also considered necessary. Not just sort of an extra add-on. That's, you know, nice to know that as well. But it's, you know, you figure that one out too. So then, therefore, number four, he has realized the relation between permanent and non-product. So that's something that'll be useful as we go along to know that. So any guys got questions?
If we posit an example of a dissimilar class, so does it have to, just to be clear, does it have to be a common locus of the counter of the of the predicate and the sign of the counter pervasion? I guess it does, but I just wanted to check.
Well, the dissimilar class in the proof of sounds impermanent, it has to be just empty of impermanence, isn't it? So if it is the dissimilar class in the proof of sounds impermanent, it is, you know, if it is empty of impermanent, it will be there. And that just means not impermanent then. It's in the dissimilar class and the proof of sounds impermanent, provided it is not impermanent.
So correct this. I thought for correct dissimilar example. I said it wrong.
Oh, I thought you said class.
Yeah, I did. Maybe I got it wrong. It was when we have the subject sounds impermanent because it's a product. It's like uncomposed space.
Well, that's dissimilar example, yeah.
Dissimilar example.
That's an example of dissimilar example, and yeah.
That dissimilar example has to be a common locus of yeah, the counter pervasion, the predicate and the sign of the counter pervasion. So sign
Well,
impermanence of product.
it has to be not the predicate and not the sign.
Yeah, a common locus of the two.
Yeah, not being the predicate. So if its sound is impermanent by the sign product, so it has to be not impermanent and also not a product.
So you could use a non-existent as well. But in our example, we've got uncomposed space.
Yes, you could use, but you know, you have to use one that's going to have some force for the in the argument. You know, so you have to use. You know, you have to, like if you said sound, it follows it's impermanent because it's a product, just like omniscient consciousness or something. But if you know, if you're an ordinary person with no idea what omniscient consciousness is, it's a bit useless to use a similar example that the opponent's never going to have heard of. You know, you've got to have something within his range, or something that's going to be useful for him. So if you give a dissimilar example, given non-existent, okay, theoretically it's possible, but is it, you know, it's got to be something that's useful for the opponent, you know, to help him kind of, you know, get into the reasoning and get the understanding. Yes, but that's what it says, isn't it? It just has to be held as a dissimilar example, and it does not possess the two. It does not possess the two. We found out in the case of, say, sound as impermanent by the sign product, it isn't impermanent, it isn't a product. So yeah, you could have a rabbit hole there, I should think. Yeah. Okay, Marco. So the subject product, it follows it is a correct sign, is it?
Excellent.
The subject product, it follows it's a quasi sign.
Why?
Because it is the two, a correct sign and a quasi sign.
Okay, accept.
Well, that was easy. What do you say, Anela? Did we ask you about this one? Follows as a common locus of correct sign and a quasi sign.
No, there is not. The reason not established.
I didn't give a reason, did I?
No.
No wonder it's not established.
Why?
Because product is such an instance, such an example of being a correct sign and a quasi sign.
Reason not established.
Subject product, it is a correct sign. You accept that?
Yes, I accept.
Subject product follows as a quasi sign
Why?
because it is a quasi sign in the proof of sound being permanent.
No pervasion.
So the subject product is a quasi sign in the proof of sound as permanent.
I accept.
So it follows as a quasi sign
Why?
because there's a quasi sign in the proof of sound as impermanent.
No pervasion.
If there's a pot in this room, it's necessarily a pot.
Yes, but in this room is
Accept.
necessarily pot. I accept.
And if there's a pot on top of my head, it's necessarily pot.
I accept.
A bottle on top of my head.
I accept.
Yes. So then if there's a quasi sign in the proof of sound as permanent, it's necessarily a quasi sign.
Why?
It's a quasi sign in that instance, therefore it's a quasi sign.
No, there is no pervasion.
So then if it's a correct sign in the proof of some particular thing, it's not necessarily a correct sign because the reasoning is the same.
No, it's not the same.
Well, it makes sense, doesn't it? If it's a dissimilar example in the proof of that, but it's not a dissimilar example. Sorry, yes, but it's not a, sorry. It's a quasi sign in the proof of that. So, but that doesn't make it a quasi sign. So if it's a correct sign in the proof of that, that doesn't make it a correct sign. Same.
No, it's not the same because if it has chance to be correct sign anywhere, it's the correct sign, and nothing can be both correct sign and quasi sign. So there is nothing which is quasi sign. We spoke about it last time.
Yeah, but some people haven't understood yet. Still having doubts. So we're hoping you could clear it up. I'm not sure if you have.
We were having the position sometimes in debate that in general it is not mutually exclusive, but applied to a base it is mutually exclusive, applied to a specific syllogism.
So pot is, or say, let's say product, it follows it is a correct sign and a dissimilar sign.
So,
Quasi sign.
Quasi sign, I was saying. Sorry. Correct sign, so it's a correct sign and an incorrect sign.
yeah,
So there's a common locus of correct sign and incorrect sign.
yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
So there's a common locus of A and not A.
What?
Because there's a common locus of correct sign and an incorrect sign,
Equation.
and the reasoning is similar.
The reason is not something.
Look, it's got to be either A or not A, yeah? So then, but it's got to be either correct sign or incorrect sign. Can't be both. Okay, so part follows it's a correct sign in the proof of sound as product follows is an incorrect sign in the proof of sound is impermanent.
As impermanent.
The subject sound, it follows subject product, it follows it is an incorrect sign, a quasi sign in the proof of sound is impermanent.
Why?
Because it's a quasi sign.
No, but they,
If it's a quasi sign, it should be a quasi sign.
it is a quasi sign, but it's not a quasi sign in that.
Yeah, that's not very elegant, man. It's something with both a quasi sign and a correct sign.
You apply the same thing to a cause and effect. No? In general, mutual inclusive. Apply to a base mutual exclusive.
Yeah, well, everything is both a cause and effect. Every functioning thing is both a cause and an effect.
So
But to say everything is both a correct sign and a quasi sign, that's going a bit far.
that's right.
So we have to think about that in terms of a dissimilar example as well, because the reasoning is similar. You know, he says, if it is a, what does it say? If it is that which is held as a similar example as a definition of similar example, that which is held as a similar example in the proof of sound is impermanent, is a definition of similar example in the proof of sound is impermanent. But it doesn't say that which is held as a dissimilar example is a definition of dissimilar example. And that which is held as a dissimilar example in the proof of sound is impermanent. It doesn't say that's a dissimilar example in the proof of sound is impermanent. So he's making a difference there. So that might help you. So yeah, similar example, dissimilar example. Isn't it better to have them both, you know, as being somehow more elegant to be contradictory?
Apply to base as it.
Well, to figure out the system of our own system. Yeah. You might figure out some superior system of your own, but what's our own system? What's the what's the system of the text? Anyway, we'll have to stop there, otherwise we're going all night. Yeah, so I look forward to seeing you next week, next Tuesday.